Last Sunday I mentioned that I wanted to tell an important story about somebody connected to our church, Suzanna LaFave. Raise your hand, Suzanna. You're going to meet her in just a few moments. It's an amazing story about an amazing young woman, but it also involves a lot more people than just her. So we're going to be talking to different people in a moment. But as she sat in my office this past week and talked about what she wants to share, the words of Paul in Romans came to mind, especially verses 3 through 5 of Romans 5. So in Romans, Paul says this: "Therefore, since we are justified by faith, we have peace with God through our Lord Jesus Christ, through whom we have obtained access to this grace in which we stand, and we boast in our hope of sharing the glory of God." And this is where I think it really reflects Susanna's story. And not only that, but we also boast in our sufferings, knowing that suffering produces endurance, and endurance produces character, and character produces hope, and hope does not disappoint us, because God's love has been poured into our hearts through the Holy Spirit that has been given to us. As I mentioned, this story I became aware of before even I became aware of Suzanna. And to help me start telling it, I want to introduce you to our custodian, the first and finest custodian at the First United, Gina Ellis. Come on up, Gina. If you don't know Gina, this is Gina Ellis, married to Jerry. And they both support and help our church in a lot of ways besides Gina's time on staff. And Gina and Jerry are members of the Zion United Methodist Church, and just a wonderful person to know. To kind of give you the context of how this story arose from my perspective, it was Holy Week 2 years ago, 2015, Wednesday, before our last Lenten dinner. And the church staff, Kathy, our secretary, and Gina and I were sitting around a table out in the Welcome Center having a conversation. And Gina starts sharing with Kathy and me that she's kind of had this burden. She's got this young girl on her mind that she just can't seem to stop thinking about. And she wondered where she was. What was going through your head as you thought about that? Who was this person? What did you know about her? And why was she stuck in your head that day?
Well, Susanna's name came up on Palm Sunday. As we were leaving church Palm Sunday morning, one young woman at church stood up and said, "Before everyone leaves, we need to remember and pray for Susanna. Remember the young girl that lived with?" And she said the woman's name, and we all said, "Yeah." And she said, "Well, she's gotten in a lot of trouble, and she's done some bad things, and she's living with a guy in town and everything, and just please be praying for her." So we left church, and Jerry and I got in the van, and he said, "Do you believe any of that they were telling about Susanna?" And I said, "No, I don't believe any of that." And he said, "I don't either, and if I knew where she was, I would go get her, and we'd give her a home." So at that point, we began trying to figure out how we could find out where she was and what had happened. We incorrectly assumed she was a foster child that had possibly aged out of the foster care system. So our middle daughter works at Sparrow Family Services, formerly known as the United Methodist Children's Home. And so we asked her, "Could you find out about after care program for foster kids?" So she said, yeah, she'd talk to Kay Zibby Dameron and see what she could find out, but we're really busy right now, and there's going to be a lot going on, but I'll see what I can do. That, I just couldn't get her off of my mind. I kept thinking about her to the point we even went over and saw Jerry's mom and dad and talked to them about it, and he said, "You need to find the kid. Something bad could happen to her." And she's really been on our minds.
So Gina starts just wondering out loud, Kathy's our witness, I wonder if there's any way to open up foster child records and learn something about where that kid may be now that they're 18. And what happened as we were talking about that?
Julie Webb walked in the door.
Julie Webb, she was at the first service. She's gone to be with family for Memorial Day, and I put her on the spot, brought her up here. Julie Webb walked in the door, and you asked her that question. Is there any way, after kids turned 18, to open up their foster care records and find out where they are? And Julie said, no, there wasn't. And then do you remember the question that Julie asked us, which seemed kind of out of context given the conversation?
Julie said, well, what does this young girl look like?
And you said?
I said, well, she's not very tall, not very big, has long dark hair, and she's Asian, and her name's Suzanna. And that's all I know. I didn't even know her last name.
And what did Julie say?
Julie got this strange look on her face, and she said, "You need to call Lifeboat." And I said, "What?" And she said, "You need to call Lifeboat right now. Call Lifeboat or go fix those people supper tonight. But you need to call Lifeboat."
And what happened from there?
From there, I called Lifeboat. The young lady who answered the phone, the minute I explained, I told her, "I'm Gina Ellis. I'm the custodian at the First United Methodist Church. If you need to know who I am, verify my identity and my character, please call and talk to either the pastor, Victor Long, or the church secretary, Kathy Noonan. They'll verify who I am and that I'm a good person. I'm not wanting to harm this child." And I explained that, we were looking for a young Asian girl named Suzanna. And the minute I said that, I knew I had found her, because the woman started, "Well, I can't talk to you. I can't give you any information. I'll have to have your name and number and have someone call you." And so from there, I gave her my name and my number. We hung up, and within 10 minutes or so, Jenny McCarthy, the director, called and said, "Why are you looking for this young girl?" And I said, "Well, my husband and I had 4 kids of our own. Our youngest got married a year and a half or so ago. We have a bedroom, a whole entire upstairs that's empty. And if we could find that girl, we would give her a home and a family." And she said, "Well, I can't tell you anything, but if I would see her, I'll give her your name and number."
Now, I want you to get this. Gina is just sharing this, wondering, how can I find this girl? Julie Webb literally walks in off the street to check something else out about a church event. They start this conversation, and within a matter of minutes, Gina knows exactly where Suzanna is. And within an hour, they slipped a note under Susanna's door, and wasn't it within an hour that you actually had conversation with her?
It wasn't even an hour. It was probably within 30 minutes. I was talking to Susanna on the phone.
From not knowing where she is to talking to her on the phone, and then, this is Wednesday, how long before she moved into your home?
I spoke with her and said, "Can you give me tomorrow to get no one had been up there in a year and a half. I said, "Can you give me tomorrow to get the cobwebs and the dead ladybugs out? And we'll move you in on Friday." So on Good Friday, 2015, when I got off work at noon, we drove to Lifeboat, Jerry and I did, and we picked Susanna and her belongings up.
Which is pretty amazing when you think about it. Susanna, why don't you come on up? This is Susanna Lefebvre. This is the young girl we're talking about. But again, remember, Gina had this girl on her mind. She starts talking about, how can I figure out where she's at? Julie Webb walks in the door. Within minutes, we know where she is. Within an hour, she's talking to her. Within 36 hours, she has moved in with Jerry and Gina Ellis. And Gina even had some apprehension, like, I don't know anything about her. I just don't know. And we're inviting this stranger in.
Yeah, our acquaintance was very casual.
Yeah.
She had attended
Yeah.
church. All I really knew was her first name was Susanna.
Yeah.
That was it.
Which to me in itself was a miracle that I witnessed. I saw it happen. Susanna, welcome again.
Hello again.
We've been through this once. We want to make sure her mic is up where everybody can hear.
I think I'm on now.
Yeah.
Yep, I'm definitely on.
But can you kind of give us, she's going to give her full testimony in just a few moments about her life, but can you give us a condensed version? You're born in China. How did you get from China to Mount Vernon, Illinois?
Well, I was born in China and I was abandoned as a baby. And then someone found me, took me to the orphanage, and I stayed in that orphanage for 4 years. And at 4 years old, I was adopted by a family in America. And they took me back to the United States, and I lived with them for the next 10 years. And they lived in the Midwest region, like Iowa and Northern Illinois. And then they decided they didn't want me. And at 14, they met someone on the internet, and she was a lady who offered to take me in and give me a home. And so she was down in the Mount Vernon area, and she kept me until I was 18, and then she abandoned me. And I was,
Basically, at 18, the adoptive family stopped the payments to this woman, and what'd she do?
and she went and dropped me off at the Mount Vernon Walmart. And I was left with absolutely nothing but the clothes on my back.
She had a friend that she knew she could call on and spend a night or two with the friend, and then I guess with this woman you'd volunteered at a food pantry in town
Yes.
and found out about lifeboat shelter. So how did that come about?
So the first night I went to someone that I knew, and they took me to the food pantry the next day where I was volunteering at, and I went and asked for help there, and I met a lady who was a friend even before this time, and she helped me a lot in getting into the shelter, and she has always been there, and she still is always there for me.
And so she's in lifeboat shelter, our homeless shelter in town. Jane McCorkle became one of the persons who was working with her. She got to know Jane. She needed clothes, and Jane put her in touch with Angels on Assignment. Patty Thomas, I think, was one of the people who helped her there. So she was already making some contact with our church. But, I want to say, don't ever doubt that your gifts to Lifeboat Shelter aren't making a difference in somebody's life. This is evidence of that important ministry to folks who have no place to go. Suzanne was one of them. I want to go back to Gina real quickly because this is another interesting piece of this story. After Suzanna moved into your home, one of the first problems you encountered is that Suzanna had absolutely no proof of who she was. She had no identity. She could not prove who she was. In fact, if that lady if she died in the custody of that lady, Suzanna could have just faded and nobody would have ever known any different. But without an ID, you couldn't put her in school. You couldn't get a driver's license. You couldn't get a job. You had no birth certificate. You had nothing. And this is another interesting, fascinating, amazing part of the story. So what did you do, Gina, to start that process of trying to prove who Suzanna was?
Well, it seemed as though everything I did, I kept hitting brick walls. And finally, in desperation, Suzanna knew the orphanage that she had spent the first 4 years of her life in. So I Googled it. Lin Jing Welfare Society. And I looked all through that website, couldn't find anything that I thought would be of any help at all. But down at the bottom of the first page that comes up, there was a gentleman's name, Brian something, with a phone number in China. I called the number in China on my lunch one day here at the church, and I got a man who said he was in New York City.
She called China. It rang in New York City.
Yeah. But the strangest thing of all is I started explaining who I was, who Suzanna was to me, and what we were trying to do, and that we were desperate to try to find some kind of proof of her adoption, her citizenship, and her paperwork, so that she could become a human being that existed instead of just no one.
We take that so much for granted. Suzanna couldn't prove who she was, couldn't get medical care, couldn't get in school, couldn't do anything, couldn't take a GED.
Couldn't do anything.
Because she had no proof of her identity.
This gentleman said, "Oh, well, you're in luck. My wife was adopted from that very same orphanage." And he said, "Could you give me her birth date?" And so I told him the birth date that Suzanna has. And he started searching through some sort of files that he had, and he said, "Oh, I found her finding ad," is what he called it. And I said, "Well, I have no idea what that is." And he said, "Well, basically it's where they put an ad in the paper that tells everyone in China this child will be put up for adoption if no one claims this child." And that's the finding ad that very day, within just a few minutes, I got that in it. I think I got it in a text. He sent it to my cell phone with his cell phone.
So this is the ad that advertised Suzanna being available for adoption. And I understand you got it. You're working at Alley Cuisine, and the folks there helped you interpret what it said. So that was a step, but it wasn't everything you needed. In fact, I know you were helped by Judge JoBeth Weber. You were helped by Judge Ken Myers in the federal system. At one point, you were in St. Louis, where they have the federal records, and they were this close to Susanna's adoption records, which had her birth certificate, but they could not show them to Susanna because she couldn't prove who she was.
We could see her picture.
They could see them, but they could not, legally, they could not show them to her because she had no ID. So long story short, Judge JoBeth Weber especially helped in getting an affidavit and getting things in place, and we got a state ID issued for Susanna. Gina, from the start, you said you wanted to provide Susanna with some normal kid things. Like what?
Well, the main thing that became very apparent was as we were searching for school records or anything to prove her identity, it became painfully obvious that Susanna had been denied the opportunity to be around other children her age. She had spent maybe a year and a half in school with other kids. And so the main thing Jerry and I wanted was for her to be able to be around people close to her age and to learn how to socialize and just be a normal kid. And so the very first thing we tried to do was to get her in school. And we contacted Weber High School, and John Ashby and Bobby Herzing out there said, "Oh, absolutely, we'll let her attend class." But they did far more than let her attend class. She was a cheerleader. She sang in the choir.
But at that point, she was just attending. She had no formal record. They couldn't create a transcript.
No, they told us that she would never be able to graduate because we still had no proof she was who she said she was. They took her in without any ID, just on my and Jerry's word. And she went to school for 2 years every day thinking she was going just for the socialization and hopefully to learn a little something. They stuck her in as a junior. And
But once we got the ID ironed out, they worked, and you found out early this year you could get a diploma. And then just a couple weeks ago, you graduated with a high school diploma from Weber Township High School, not having missed out on school the 4 years before completely and having minimal education before. Now, I want you to tell everybody here what your GPA was.
Well, my junior year I had a 4.0, and my senior year is a 3.9. So,
Deprived of formal education, she was able to come out and make those kinds of grades, which is just extraordinary in itself. Now, Susanna, you've told me some of what it was like to live with this woman who had you for 4 years in Jefferson County. She never put you in school. She didn't take very good care of you. I remember you telling me when the police showed up, you were told to run. You weren't supposed to be around anyway. But one story that really stuck with me and really disturbed me was about the time that she went in the hospital. And I asked Suzanna to tell this. She doesn't want any sympathy, and I don't want it to be told just for the salacious nature of it, but because we need to understand that this kind of stuff is happening in our midst with people we know. So I'm thinking of when she went to the hospital. Can you tell us what that experience was like?
well, she was in the hospital for about a week, and she had a concrete garage where she locked me in, and I had no access to food, water, or anything, and it was February, so it was very cold outside, and the garage was not much warmer. And I had some bedding, but I still slept on the floor, and only time I ate was when her son came home from work and he allowed me to get like a can of soup or something, just once a day. And
Locked up in a concrete garage during the month of February, no plumbing, no food, no water. One person checked one time during the day to give her something to eat. That happened here in Jefferson County. Another story you just told me this past week was about her making you weed in her garden. Can you tell them about that?
I did a lot of outside chores, a lot of them unnecessary, and one of them was she had a fairly large garden, and it was out with no trees around it, and she made me weed that, and I couldn't eat until I was finished and every tiny weed was pulled. And at night, I wasn't allowed to go in the house to sleep. I slept out on a concrete pad with no cover, nothing. And she didn't care. She didn't care about my sunburn. She didn't care about the cold. And
You weren't allowed to eat until you had completely weeded her garden. How long was that?
it's a week.
A week. A week. Making her work and not eat. Suzanna, did you feel like giving up?
From the time I was 10 years old until I was 18, I constantly thought of either committing suicide or running away. Running away was not an option because I had nowhere to go, because I knew nobody, and they kept it that way. As for the suicide, I knew I couldn't do it because my faith in God had taught me that my life is not mine to take, it is God's. And He will decide when I go and where, how. And I knew at some point that this nightmare had to end sometime, somehow. And I wanted to see what would happen after that. And I wanted to try to make a difference after I got out of my abusive situations.
She had a sense of God's presence in her life in spite of all this abuse and all the horror of these experiences, which is just an extraordinary testimony in itself. Gina, I want to ask you this again. What has having Suzanna in your life and in your home and in your family meant to you and to your family?
Well, anytime we have something like this, or Susanna's baccalaureate graduation the other night, we have people that come up to us and they'll tell us how much we've been such a blessing to Susanna. We've just, and they kind of make over you almost to the point where you're embarrassed. But what they don't understand, and I can't even explain to you, is the blessing that we received from helping Susanna is far greater than anything we could have ever done for Susanna. Just to see Susanna, she didn't just fly, she soared. She's taken every, in the scripture it talks about using your talents. Susanna uses her talents to the best of her abilities, and she does it for the glory of God, to point to Him. So it's been an awesome blessing.
She is a blessing to you, but it also kind of cracked open your heart
Oh, yeah.
for what God had been wanting to do in your life.
Yeah, having her taught Jerry and I that we could take someone else's child, it didn't matter what ethnicity they were, what they'd been through, what other people may see as damaged and broken. It taught us that we could take that child and love them no matter what, and try to walk through the struggles with them. So she's taught us a lot.
And that's what God had been leading you toward for a long time, and it was Susanna that helped you see that really is what God's calling you to do.
It was possible.
Which is just amazing. Now, Susanna, a week or so ago, gave her testimony at the baccalaureate service for Weber Township High School, and so we're going to conclude by having her just share her testimony, her story with each of you. So thank you, Gina and Susanna. We're ready to listen.
Many of you in the sanctuary know me because I'm Gina and Jerry Ellis's daughter, and I hang around the church a lot. However, today was the first time for many of you to hear my story, and that story was my past and has shaped me into the person that I am today. Before I begin, and I like to say again what Victor's already said. I don't want sympathy. I'm not asking for pity. That is not the reason behind telling my story. It is to be a testimony of God's love, mercy, and power. I was born in China 20 years ago and abandoned at a street market as a newborn baby. A civilian found me, took me to a police station, and from there I was taken to the local orphanage. I lived in that orphanage for the next 4 years. And at the age of 4, I was adopted by an American couple who had already adopted 2 other girls from China. They took me back to America, and I lived with them for the next 10 years. For reasons that I have yet to learn, my adoptive mother verbally, mentally, emotionally, and physically abused me all throughout those 10 years. The rest of the family looked at me in disgust and pretended I wasn't there. I was told I was not wanted, that I was the brat, and that they wished they had left me to rot in the orphanage in China. My birthday was never celebrated because they said that they weren't glad that I was born. And in their eyes, I was lower than their dogs, and they hated me. In fact, they would tell me that they didn't even hate me because to do that, it takes feeling, and they didn't care. They didn't feel anything for me, which that in itself is an admission of hatred. They carry that same hatred of me to this day. They believed I made their lives miserable, and they went to extremes to make sure that I suffered in misery too. I was isolated to the point where I hated life and envied my sisters who had normal, good lives. I wasn't allowed to eat with the family at the dinner table because I was too much of an embarrassment, and they didn't want to acknowledge my presence at all. And I was allowed no privacy whatsoever. There are things they did to me that I simply cannot bring myself to tell. Like I had mentioned before, I began considering suicide when I was at the tender age of 10, and those suicidal thoughts never stopped until I was 18. My adoptive mother always told me that if she had a place to send me, she would send me there. And one day, when I was 14 years old, she found that place. She met a woman on the internet who was willing to take me for a certain price per month. Without any knowledge of the whole scheme, I was taken down here to Southern Illinois and basically became her slave. The load of physical work she placed on me was oftentimes more than I could bear. Whether it was the heat of summer or the cold of winter, I did more chores than necessary, and often out of unreasonable or unexplainable punishment. From stacking wood to digging up tree roots with a shovel to weeding the garden in the full burning sun to washing clothes by hand, I did everything. And no matter how hard, how fast, or how much I worked, it was never good enough. I got no reward, and I never received a single simple thank you. It was always, why are you so lazy? Why can't you do anything right? What is wrong with you that you didn't do this the way I told you? How I survived those next 4 years is beyond my comprehension. My only answer is the power and strength God gave me and the power of prayer. At the age of 14, when I moved from one home to the other, I had completed every grade from 1st to 8th successfully. Once the guardianship was turned over to this woman, I received no education, no matter how hard I begged or pleaded. Not only was the physical labor unbearable, but also the mental and emotional abuse. With both women, I was forced to show no emotion whatsoever. Showing anger, sadness, anything, even joy, often resulted in punishment more painful than it was worth. I was only supposed to show gratitude for being rescued from China and given a roof to live under. To them, I was an ungrateful brat. Oftentimes, I would be punished until my attitude had changed to an appearance of happiness. When I went into public, which wasn't often, I was told to wear a smile and act happy because I had chosen this life of misery. When I turned 18, the money my guardian was receiving from my adoptive family quit coming in, and she had no use for me anymore and told me to leave. She dropped me off at the Mount Vernon Walmart to wander on my own. I was relieved to finally be free, but also scared. I had only the clothes on my back and a little cash from selling chicken eggs. I looked awful because my clothes were old and ragged, and I hadn't been allowed to change out of them for weeks. I stayed overnight with someone I knew, and then asked them to take me to the food pantry where I was volunteering at the time. There I knew I'd find help, and I did. I met a lady who helped me get into Lifeboat, where I stayed for the next month. That lady is still very special to me today. One day I came upon a note tucked under the door of my room. It read that Gina Ellis from church I had gone to, and yes, both of my abusers were church-going Christians, wanted to contact me. I called her, and she made the best offer in the world. After thinking about it, I realized that I had a lot to learn as I was kept away from the outside world for 14 years. She offered to help me get used to the world. She offered to be my mother, something that I never had, ever. This was an opportunity that I would have been foolish to pass up, and I'm so glad that I didn't. I'm not legally their daughter, but I still call Gina and Jerry Mom and Dad. My new family gave me everything I needed: comfort, assurance, love, kindness, experience. They got me into high school as a junior, as was mentioned before, and I went to school for 2 years, believing that I couldn't graduate with a diploma. I simply went to have a chance to be a kid, learn about society, and maybe learn some things at school. I guess that's what school's for. The second semester of my senior year, I received the incredible news that the state would let me graduate with a high school diploma. That day was one of the best days of my life. I had been told as a teenager that I'd never get a diploma, never get a driver's license, and I'd never go anywhere in life. Now, I have my driver's license, I have my diploma, and I will continue to prove them wrong for the rest of my life. Today, I still carry some emotional damage from all of the abuse. It's always been hard for me to write my testimonies. Every time I've cried. I've chosen to forgive my abusers who will claim they have done nothing wrong, and they'll say that I deserve the treatment that they gave me. I have chosen to forgive because there is no use in hanging on to bitterness. There's no use in holding myself back. My theory is you don't get very far, very fast, or very well in life if you're always looking behind you and always being negative or thinking life owes you. I think you owe it to yourself to stay positive, trust in God, and never give up. A verse that has helped me is 2 Corinthians 4:8-9. It says, "We are hard-pressed on every side, but not crushed. We are perplexed, but not in despair. Persecuted, but not abandoned. Struck down, but not destroyed." I've always thought, if God is for us, who can be against us? I'm so grateful to everyone in this church for their support, for the staff especially. I'm thankful to my boyfriend, my friends, every loved one. But most importantly, I'm thankful to God for giving me another chance. Thank you.
I said this at the first service today because you have not heard the gospel. you have seen the gospel today. This is the good news of a God who loves us and cares about us and whose grace is at work in our lives before we ever know it. If we just pay attention, this God wants to reach down and love us and help us and bring us back. I've told Suzanna she's beautiful inside and out. Most folks who've been through that kind of abuse wouldn't be able to hold their head up straight very long. But she has emerged remarkably intact. And that's a tribute to who she is. It's a tribute to how she's allowed God to help her and guide her. She and Dylan sang a song at the first service this morning, and I think they're willing to give it a try again if you'd indulge them. So let's thank Suzanna for her words. Remember our app, our website, findhopedowntown.org, through which you can give, stay connected, or watch sermon videos that you might have missed.